This is the final, corrected synthesis for the current dataset, incorporating the critical clarification that the pass charts are shown from the quarterback's perspective, meaning chart right corresponds to Denver's defensive left, and chart left corresponds to Denver's defensive right. With that orientation correction applied, all prior zone evaluations remain valid and are now simply mirrored correctly. Denver's most consistent defensive strength is its control of the middle of the field and its ability to generate turnovers. Across the dataset, interceptions repeatedly occur in the hook zone at 5 to 10 yards over the middle, the hole zone at 10 to 20 yards between the hashes, and the deep middle on post and seam routes. This is corroborated by next-gen stats ball production from safeties and second-level defenders such as Jones, McMillian, Starnod, and Greenlaw. The interpretation is clear. Denver's robber concepts, help rules, and safety range are legitimate strengths, and quarterbacks who repeatedly attack between the hashes eventually pay for it with negative outcomes. Another confirmed strength is Denver's ability to force low-leverage passing while keeping overall efficiency deceptively low. Across a wide range of quarterbacks, Denver consistently funnels targets into swing routes, flat routes, hook routes, and curl routes, while suppressing sustained success in the hole and deep zones. Although completion percentages may appear respectable on the surface, expected points added remains low. This is a textbook example of a false efficiency defense. Completions are allowed, but meaningful leverage and scoring value are not. The data also confirms that the defensive right side, anchored by Pat Surtain, is not a problem area. Next, GenStats aligns with what the pass chart suggested, showing tight separation, a high rate of tight window targets, and low expected points added allowed. Offenses consistently avoid this side of the field when possible, reinforcing the conclusion that Denver's defensive right is not where opposing quarterbacks want to live. Once the orientation is corrected, Denver's primary structural weakness becomes sharply defined. The most consistent vulnerability appears on the deep outside of Denver's defensive left. Multiple touchdowns and explosive plays show up on the quarterback's right side of the chart, which maps directly to Denver's defensive left boundary. This pattern repeats across multiple quarterbacks, including Jordan Love, Geno Smith, Jalen Hurts, Justin Herbert, and Daniel Jones, the latter combining deep shots with underneath efficiency. The interpretation is straightforward. When offenses are able to protect the quarterback and properly layer route concepts, Denver's defensive left outside lane is prone to explosive breakdowns. This is the most repeatable scoring vulnerability identified in the current dataset. Beyond pure deep shots, Denver's defensive left is stressed across the entire vertical stack through classic flood concepts. The pass charts show touchdowns in the right flat from the quarterback's perspective, which maps directly to Denver's defensive left flat. Underneath that, curl and out route completions consistently stack up, and once Denver squats on short routes or rotates coverage, deep outside shots land over the top. The interpretation is that this is textbook sideline flood stress, and the relationship between Denver's defensive left cornerback and the safety over the top is the primary pressure point. Underneath access in the hook and hole zones is also a real vulnerability rather than a cosmetic concession. Next-gen stats makes this unavoidable, particularly with Alex Singleton in coverage. He allows high separation, gives up massive yards after the catch, and is responsible for elevated touchdowns and expected points added allowed. This aligns precisely with the pass charts, which show sustained hook and curl volume and death by 1,000 cuts games, with Daniel Jones being the clearest example. The interpretation is that underneath access becomes genuinely damaging when offenses remain on schedule and are not forced into obvious passing situations. Taken together, this defines a coherent defensive identity for Denver in the current dataset. The defense is excellent at baiting and punishing throws over the middle of the field, and it is comfortable conceding short completions that do not immediately threaten leverage. At the same time, it is structurally vulnerable to layered outside concepts on the defensive left and becomes exposed underneath when linebackers are forced to move laterally and cover in space. This profile is consistent and repeatable, not statistical noise. For this batch of data, the analysis itself is complete. What would elevate it from high confidence to near certainty would be additional alignment splits, such as left cornerback versus right cornerback versus slot usage, depth splits by defender at short, intermediate and deep levels, and safety rotation splits distinguishing single high from two high structures. Even without those layers, however, the zone-level patterns, the player-level expected points added, yards after catch, and separation data, and the repeated scoring endpoints all point to the same conclusion. Denver's defense combines real middle field strength with a persistent, exploitable vulnerability on the defensive left. Denver's defense wins by punishing throws over the middle of the field and forcing false efficiency, but it can be beaten by disciplined offenses that flood the defensive left sideline and stay on schedule underneath. That conclusion is now zone-correct, player-verified, and internally consistent. When you are ready, you can upload additional pass charts, alignment or depth splits, or rushing data, which will tie directly into the linebacker stress story, and they can be folded into this same framework without resetting anything. Your Chargers versus Broncos win metrics file is directionally correct about where Denver creates separation. Early down suppression leading to long yardage situations, followed by red zone compression. The 2025 season-to-date team data strongly verifies that overall picture, especially on defense. As the file implies, Denver's defense is built to win individual snaps and force low-probability offense rather than trade yards. They consistently deny early down comfort, win on third down, clamp down in the red zone, and end drives with sacks. Those are the exact structural pillars your file is built around. The one meaningful defensive soft spot that appears at the team level is not yardage efficiency, but takeaways. Denver does not generate many takeaways relative to its overall defensive performance, and opponents tend to convert field goals at a very high rate. The implication is that if an offense can simply cross midfield consistently, Denver will usually allow some points, even if those points often come in the form of 3 instead of 7. Where the file needs a correction is in the claim that Denver wins without raw sack volume. In 2025, Denver absolutely has raw sack production and is elite by both total sacks and sack rate. For the Chargers, pressure neutralization is not a stylistic preference, but a survival requirement. The matchup is harshly aligned against them, with the Chargers' offense struggling to prevent sacks, while Denver's defense excels at creating them. Even though the Chargers are strong at extending drives on third down, consistently reaching third down becomes costly if Denver keeps winning early downs and finishing drives with sacks. The file's emphasis on middle-of-the-field passing as the Chargers' best offensive path is also consistent with the macro matchup. Denver's defense excels at limiting completion percentage and yards per attempt, which is typical of a unit that makes outside throws and sideline access uncomfortable. The Chargers' passing production exists, but their protection profile creates a timing problem against a pass rush like Denver's. This is precisely the scenario where between the numbers, on-time throws in the 10 to 20-yard range become the only realistic way to get the ball out quickly while avoiding a steady diet of contested boundary throws. The red zone portion of your file is the clearest strength versus weakness collision in the entire matchup. The Chargers' offense has struggled to convert red zone trips into touchdowns, while Denver's defense is among the league's best at preventing red zone touchdowns. That combination is why the file is correct to treat red zone execution as a threshold variable. If the Chargers continue settling for field goals, Denver's defensive structure is designed to survive it. The counterweight is that Denver is unusually permissive when opponents attempt field goals, meaning the Chargers can at least accumulate points if they can repeatedly reach scoring range. On the other side of the ball, the matchup tilts closer to strength on strength, which is where the Chargers' best-case scenario lives. Denver's offense has been efficient and productive while doing an excellent job of avoiding sacks. That directly attacks one of the Chargers' defense's most reliable advantages, because while the Chargers are good at generating pressure, Denver is built to prevent sacks from becoming drive-ending events. If the Chargers are going to flip the game defensively, it likely will not be by living on sacks. Instead, it will come from creating extra possessions. The Chargers' defense has been effective at generating takeaways and interceptions, while Denver's overall turnover margin has been poor. That is the cleanest verified Chargers advantage lever in the matchup. Put simply, the season-to-date verification says this: Denver holds the cleaner drive-killing edge through defensive efficiency, sack production, and red zone denial, while the Chargers hold the cleaner game-flipping edge through takeaways and pass defense. If the Chargers win, the statistical story will look very much like your file predicts. The offense survives Denver's sack profile through quick middle-field rhythm throws and disciplined throwaways, generates a small number of explosives to avoid relying on 14-play drives, and finishes at least a couple red zone trips with touchdowns despite the difficult red zone matchup. If Denver wins, it will look like their verified identity. Early down wins create long yardage situations. Sacks and tight window throws kill drives. The Chargers settle for field goals, and Denver's offense plays from ahead with low sack exposure and enough red zone success to control the game. To beat Denver, your model establishes clear and concrete win condition thresholds for the Chargers. The core idea is that the Chargers must control the game structurally rather than stylistically, because Denver's defense is designed to punish mistakes, compress leverage, and win through disruption. Every metric in the framework maps directly to an in-game requirement rather than an abstract efficiency goal. The first and most critical condition is early down control. The Chargers must avoid living in long yardage situations, which is where Denver's defense becomes most dangerous. In practical terms, this means achieving an early down expected points, added per play, of at least plus 0.15 on first and second down, an early down success rate of at least 50%, and keeping third and 7+ situations under 30% of dropbacks. If the Chargers fail here, the rest of the plan becomes fragile, because Denver can lean into disguise, simulated pressure, and low-leverage throws that stall drives. Explosive passing is the second pillar, and the model is explicit that completions alone are not enough. Denver is comfortable conceding short gains without breaking. The Chargers must generate real explosives, defined as a 20+ yard explosive pass rate of at least 12 to 14% of completions, yards per attempt of at least 7.8, and a minimum of 2 explosive touchdown drives. The key nuance is that one isolated big play does not meaningfully shift the game. Explosives must translate directly into scoring leverage. Protection is the third and most fragile requirement. Denver wins through disruption and hesitation, so the Chargers must neutralize pressure. The thresholds are a pressure rate allowed of 30% or lower, a sack rate of 5% or lower, and a quarterback expected points added per play under pressure no worse than minus 0.05. In game terms, this means sacks cannot become drive killers, and even when pressure arrives, the offense must avoid negative expected points outcomes that flip field position or momentum. The model also dictates that the Chargers must live in the middle of the field, because Denver's outside corner strength pushes offenses away from the boundary. The targets here are a middle-of-field completion rate of at least 70%, middle-of-field expected points added per play of at least plus 0.20, and 8 to 10 targets between the numbers at 10 to 20 air yards. These throws, digs, seams, benders, and inbreakers form the offense's sustainable value engine and are essential for staying on schedule without exposing the quarterback to excessive risk. In the red zone, the margin tightens dramatically. Denver's defense is built to survive field goals, so the Chargers must be clinical. The win thresholds require a red zone touchdown rate of at least 65%, no more than one red zone field goal, and 0 red zone turnovers. The model treats red zone efficiency as a threshold variable rather than a gradient. If the Chargers repeatedly settle for 3 points, Denver's defensive identity is structurally advantaged over the course of the game. The run game does not need to dominate by volume, but it must function as a constraint on linebackers and coverage structure. The thresholds are a rushing expected points added per play of at least 0, a run success rate of at least 45%, and at least 4 successful runs against light boxes. This is not about establishing the run for its own sake, but about forcing Denver to pay for pass-first structures and preventing linebackers from freely expanding into passing lanes. Defensively, the Chargers must prevent Denver from playing comfortably or generating quick strike scoring. The targets are holding Denver to an expected points added per play of minus 0.05 or worse, allowing no more than 2 explosive plays, keeping third down conversion rate allowed under 38%, and creating at least 1 short field takeaway or equivalent swing event, such as a sudden change possession or major field position flip. If only a small set of indicators can be tracked during the game, the condensed checklist is straightforward. Early down expected points added per play of at least plus 0.15. Pressure rate allowed of 30% or less. Explosive pass rate of at least 12%. Middle of field expected points added per play of at least plus 0.20. Red zone touchdown rate of at least 65%. 0 red zone turnovers. And opponent expected points added per play of minus 0.05 or worse. Using these thresholds, a Monte Carlo win simulation for Chargers at Broncos was run with 2025 season-to-date team rates as priors for turnovers, sacks, explosives, red zone, third down, and baseline scoring. Where the framework relies on advanced splits that are not publicly available in full, such as early down expected points added or quarterback expected points added under pressure, clearly labeled proxies were used, such as holding Denver to 20 points or fewer as a stand-in for opponent expected points, added per play below minus 0.05. The matchup inputs reinforce why the margins are tight. Denver's defense is built around pressure and sacks without needing to blitz heavily, and it produces consistent disruption in the passing game. From the Chargers' perspective, the primary structural risk is their tendency to allow sacks, which directly conflicts with the model's requirement to keep sack rate under 5%. This makes pressure neutralization the single most difficult box to check. There are, however, two pathways that favor the Chargers and align with the steal-the-game logic of your framework. First, the Chargers have been more opportunistic in generating takeaways, and second, their pass defense has been effective at limiting quarterback outcomes. Those factors create the possibility of extra possessions and shortened fields, which can offset disadvantages in sack rate or red zone efficiency. Red zone performance remains the loudest warning signal. The Chargers' offensive red zone touchdown rate has been well below the model's 65% requirement, while Denver's defense has been strong at forcing field goals. As a result, the simulation treats a red zone efficiency spike as one of the most important swing variables in the entire matchup. Finally, real-world context matters. Justin Herbert has been finishing the season with a broken non-throwing hand, and recent losses have been directly tied to pressure, sacks, and red zone failure. That context aligns cleanly with the checklist in your file and reinforces the idea that this matchup will be decided less by overall yardage and more by whether the Chargers can hit a narrow set of high-leverage thresholds. The Monte Carlo simulation was designed to reflect how this matchup plays out if season-to-date tendencies repeat with normal game-to-game variance, rather than functioning as a betting model. I simulated 200,000 games using blended baseline scoring from each team's points for per game, combined with the opponent's points allowed per game, with an additional 1.5 points added for Denver's home field advantage. Turnovers were generated from blended giveaway and takeaway rates using Poisson-style variability. Sacks were modeled from blended sack rates between Denver's defense and the Chargers' offense, with variability driven by per-game dropback volume. Explosive passes were modeled as 20-plus yard completions as a share of completions using binomial variability around season priors. Red zone touchdown rate and third down conversion rate were treated as variable processes around season baselines using beta binomial style variance. Because pressure rate is not directly available from public team tables, the pressure threshold of 30% or less from your file was included only as a labeled proxy derived from sack rate. With Denver's home field advantage included, the baseline simulation produced a Chargers win probability of approximately 45.5%. The average simulated score landed around Denver 23 to Chargers 22, with a mean margin of about 1.5 points in Denver's favor. Interpreted through your framework, the default game state is close but slightly tilted toward Denver unless the Chargers win one or more of the swing categories your file emphasizes, particularly turnovers, sacks, or pressure, and red zone efficiency. I then evaluated how often the Chargers hit the specific win thresholds from your checklist that can be tested or proxy tested within the simulation, and how those thresholds affected win probability when achieved. When the Chargers kept giveaways to one or fewer, which serves as a proxy for avoiding drive-killing mistakes and red zone turnovers, that condition occurred in roughly 73% of simulations, and the Chargers won about half of those games. When they failed to meet that condition, their win rate dropped to the mid-30s. When the Chargers forced at least one takeaway, that occurred in roughly 71% of simulations. And again, the win rate hovered around 50%, falling sharply when no takeaway was generated. Hitting the explosive pass threshold of at least 12% of completions occurred in roughly 64% of simulations, because both the Chargers offense and Denver defense already sit near that band by season profile. When achieved, it produced a modest lift in win probability, moving the Chargers from roughly 40% to just under 50%. Containing sack rate to 5% or lower occurred far less often, in only about 22% of simulations. When it did occur, The win rate rose into the low 50s. The key takeaway here is frequency rather than magnitude. This outcome is not the default against a Denver front that consistently generates sacks. Reaching a red zone touchdown rate of at least 65% also occurred in only about 21% of simulations, but it had one of the largest impacts on win probability. When this threshold was met, the Chargers won roughly 55% of the time, compared to the low 40s when they did not. This directly reflects your file's emphasis on red zone scoring as scoreboard leverage, and it is also the category where season-to-date priors are most unfavorable for the Chargers. Holding Denver to 20 points or fewer, used as a proxy for the defensive dominance condition of opponent expected points, added per play below minus 0.05, occurred in about 29% of simulations. When it happened, the Chargers won nearly 70% of the time. While this is partially tautological, it clearly illustrates what your defensive checklist is designed to manufacture. To map this cleanly back to your framework, I grouped 5 of your biggest offensive levers into a simple counter based on how many thresholds were hit. The bundle included pressure rate at or below 30% as a proxy, sack rate at or below 5%, explosive pass rate at or above 12% of completions, red zone touchdown rate at or above 65%, and giveaways at 1 or fewer. When the Chargers hit 0 or 1 of these conditions, they won only about 28 to 37% of the time. When they hit 3, win probability rose to roughly 56%. Hitting 4 raised it to the low 60s. Hitting all 5 pushed win probability into the mid-70s, but that perfect bundle occurred in only about 2% of simulations. The practical takeaway is that perfection is not required. The Chargers realistically need to hit 3 or 4 of these 5, with the most attainable swing trio usually being turnovers, red zone efficiency, and sack or pressure containment. Because Herbert's broken non-throwing hand has already coincided with pressure, sacks, and red zone inefficiency in recent play, I ran a sensitivity scenario in which the Chargers' baseline scoring expectation was reduced by 2 points to represent fewer finishing drives and 1 additional stalled possession. Under that assumption, the Chargers' win probability dropped from approximately 45.5% to just under 40%. That decline aligns directly with your file's thesis. This matchup turns on whether the Chargers can avoid efficient but empty possessions and survive Denver's pass rush. Putting the simulation and your checklist together, the model says that if the Chargers win, it is usually because they manufacture leverage rather than casually out-executing Denver across the board. Most often, they need to hit at least 3 of 4 game-shaping outcomes, keeping giveaways to 1 or fewer while also generating at least 1 takeaway, spiking red zone touchdown rate into the 65% band, containing sack rate near 5% or lower, and achieving an explosive completion share of at least 12%. Explosives matter most when paired with red zone finishing. Explosives without touchdown conversion are exactly the false efficiency trap your file is designed to avoid. If you want the simulation to reflect your model rather than generalized assumptions, the next step is straightforward. If you provide your actual game-level distributions for Chargers pressure rate allowed, early down expected points added, middle-of-field target volume, or similar splits, the Monte Carlo can be rerun using your true variance instead of generic rate variance. That is the cleanest way to make the outputs match the exact philosophy and structure of your win metrics framework.